Actually, instead of a study of the entire book of Revelation, we're taking a special focus of chapters 2 and 3, because in chapters 2 and 3, you have 7 letters Jesus sends to 7 churches. And every one of those letters has something to say to us today. Micah started us off last week with the first letter, the church at Ephesus. Today, we're going to be talking to the church at Smyrna, which if you look on a map, you're going to find out it's just north of Ephesus a little bit. But the situation's totally different. We're going to set that stage, and we're going to go through the verses together in a minute. But first of all, would you pray with me, please? Gracious Heavenly Father, I really am grateful for opportunities like we have today to meet together as your people. And God, just to see you a little bit better, understand you a little bit more, and allow that to have an influence over our lives, over everything we do, every decision we make. God, I do pray, just like you require of us, that we would have ears to hear. And to do that, sometimes there's some things that clutter our minds, things that weigh on us, that God, we just really need your help, so we cast our burdens on you. We ask you to take care of the things in life that are beyond us, as well as the things that we can handle, but we need your perspective. God, we want to live life in such a way, take advantage of every opportunity to serve you well, do the best that we can with the life that you give us. God, I pray that we'll be a little bit further down that road, a little bit closer to the ideal you have in mind for us, a little bit closer to Jesus and living the way he wants us to live as a result of being together with brothers and sisters today and considering your word to us. God, that's my prayer in Jesus' name. Revelation chapter 2, we're going to get into verses 8 through 10 in just a minute, but I want to tell you a quick story about this guy. His name's Ando. He's kind of famous in the world of architecture and building in Japan. He's, in fact, I guess his fame, it's out of my wheelhouse here, but I guess his fame has spread well beyond Japan. But back in 1995, he found himself in Europe when a terrible earthquake struck Japan. I don't know if you remember the news, hearing about this, but over 2,000 people lost their lives in Japan. And this is the part that gets me. Over 200,000 structures. We're talking about homes and buildings and different things. Over 200,000 structures were in various degrees of destruction. Some of them just totally leveled as a result of this earthquake and the aftershocks. I mean, it was really devastating for the country of Japan. Well, being a Japanese, and not just being Japanese, but being a builder and architect, he's doubly concerned because he's got people back home. He's concerned to find out if they're okay, if anybody died, if anybody got hurt. But he's also especially concerned because he built a lot of those buildings, a lot of those homes, and he didn't want to come home and see that maybe some people died as a result of one of his buildings collapsing, right? So he hops on the first plane. He gets back to Japan within a day and a half, and he visits people, and he checks up on family members and things like that. And then, as soon as he checks on people, the next thing he wants to do is check on all those buildings. At this point, in 1995, he was responsible for building 35 different buildings, including housing complexes, which were right on the fault line. Not a one of them fell. In fact, upon close inspection, they couldn't find even one crack in any of the 35 buildings that he was responsible for. Now, I don't know about you. Some of you may be able to relate to this more than other people, but you talk about a weight lifted off your shoulders. You talk about a sigh of relief. I mean, devastation, you're sorry for that, but at least what you built survived. Now, what does that make you think of? It makes me think of 1 Corinthians, the 3rd chapter, because in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 13, it says, if what you built survives. Now, I got to back up, because what are we talking about? What building and what surviving are we talking about? Well, if you look at verses 10 and following in 1 Corinthians, the 3rd chapter, in the first 9 verses, he talks about our relationship with God is like gardening. He uses a picture of planting and watering and having the crops grow. Then he switches in verse 10 to talk about our relationship with God and working for him is like building. We build on the firm foundation. There's only one foundation. No other foundation can be laid other than the one already given to us, which is Jesus Christ. But you and I get to build on that foundation. And here's what it says in verse 14. If what you build, in other words, you can look at your Christian life in a lot of different ways. And you can look at it as a building project, right? If what you build, what you do for the Lord, how you stand up for Him, if what you build survives, you will receive your reward. He goes on to say in verse 15 that if not, you suffer loss. You still will be saved. You know why? Because if you're in the Lord, if you're a Christian, you're saved. You get to heaven because of what Jesus did. But here's, I think, a very encouraging message for those of us who are Christians. Listen, beyond your salvation, and that's just so hard for me to say because that's everything, right? Being right with the Lord is everything. But beyond that, if what you build survives, if you just remain faithful, you will be rewarded beyond your wildest dreams. I think, in a nutshell, that's the message to the church at Smyrna. Not only is the message to the church at Smyrna, it's a message for the church throughout the years. We need to hear this. There's a lot of good reasons for being faithful, and one of the big ones, the Bible doesn't shy away from this. God wants to reward you for being faithful to Him. Are you ready for this? Revelation chapter 2, let's go ahead and start here in verse 8. It says, the angel of the church at Smyrna, and Mike already talked about this last week. We probably are talking about angelic beings. The word can mean either messenger or it can mean one of God's army, right? Because there are spiritual battles going on behind the scene. Don't have time to talk about that now, but he's talking to the church at Smyrna, which would be up the coast from Ephesus. This is in modern-day Turkey. So if you look at this, historians tell us, even today, it's a beautiful area. But especially at this time. Smyrna was really known for its beauty. A lot of people wanted to come there because it was a nice place to live. Hey, do we live in a place where a lot of people want to come to? Because it's a really nice place to live. Yeah, I think we do. I think there's a lot we can relate. He says, these are the words of Him who is the first and the last. We're going to come back to that. Who died and came back to life again. Okay, there are some things that Jesus is going to say to every single one of the churches. But there are some distinctive things that He says. He always introduces Himself in a different way, in a way to relate to the church that He's talking to. It's kind of like a teacher. If a teacher comes into a new class and he's trying to understand his students a little bit better, and he finds out that a couple of his students have disabilities, right? Maybe he would want to say, hey, you know, I've struggled with dyslexia my entire life. In fact, to this day, I really have to slow down, or I see words that just aren't there, which, by the way, that's true. But anyway, back to the story here. It's kind of like you try to build a bridge, right? You try to find common ground. Well, what is Jesus doing here when He says, I'm the first and the last, I died and came back to life again? Smyrna has a really interesting history, and it's something they took pride in. In a nutshell, man, I wish I had time to go into the details of this. It's fascinating to read. They were a planned city. They were built. It was a beautiful area, and their enemies came in and destroyed them, and for the longest period of time, nobody lived there. Till somebody came back and said, this is such a beautiful area, we've got to build this up again, and they built it up again, right? And you might think to yourself, well, you know, okay, that happened in their history. Well, you know what? You live in a certain area, and there's just certain things you take pride in. In fact, I would be willing to guess that there are a lot of people in the room here that have nothing to do with the space industry. Is that right? You have nothing to do with the space industry. But you still tell people, right? Oh, yeah, we see rockets all the time. Yeah, where I live. Yeah, you know, it's kind of like we take pride in waking up at 2 o'clock in the morning with your house. you know, right? Right? Because, yeah, we're on the space. You understand what I'm saying? There's certain things you take pride in. Well, Smyrna took pride in the fact that, oh, yeah, they wiped us out, and here we are again. You know, you can't keep a good city down, right? You know, we were alive, we're dead, and we're alive again. Okay, Jesus is saying, hey, that's me. But I like the way He presents us. There's two things about this. I am going to pick up speed, but there's two things about this I really want you to see. Before He says, I died and came back to life again, He says, I'm the first and the last. I'm the first and the last. What in the world is He communicating here? Listen, especially in the first century, they wouldn't have missed this. Go back to John the 8th chapter. Towards the end of John the 8th chapter, Jesus is talking to religious leaders, and He says to them, before Abraham was, I am. Okay, everybody knew what He was saying. In fact, how did the religious leaders respond to that? They wanted to kill Him because they knew He was making a claim, making Himself equal with God. It's exactly what He's saying again. He didn't shy away from this. Yeah, it's true. Before everybody existed, I was there. From the very beginning, in fact, in Colossians, the first chapter, he's part of, with God the Father, part of creation, involved not in just creating everything, but holding everything together in creation. There's so much to this, but what he is saying very clearly, I mean, there's a lot of different ways you can say this, but he's making a statement. Before everything was, I was there. And when everything else goes away, I'm still going to be there. Why? Because I'm God. Right? He's making this claim to be God. And then he makes this statement that builds a bridge to the church, but it also communicates something very powerful. He says, who died and came back to life again. Okay. When he says who died, that's not easy to translate. This was originally written in the Koine Greek language. And I'm going to tell you the best possible way you can translate this, and you'll probably understand why they don't translate this way, because it sounds so weird in the English language. But the best possible way to translate this, to really, really communicate what the grammar is saying here, is he says, I became dead and came back to life. Now, why in the world would he say it that way? I'll tell you why. At least this is my best understanding of this, right? In the Koine Greek, this is not classical Greek. It's a little bit different, right? But in the Koine Greek, if you wanted to talk about a phase of your life that you went through, like I went to that university for a period of time, I became a student at that university, or I became an employee of Harris Corporation from years here to here, right? That's the way you would say it. I became. In other words, you were talking about a phase that you went through in your life. That's the way Jesus talks about dying. Everybody else dies, exclamation point, end of story. Not Jesus. Jesus was, yeah, I became dead for a while. Right? Yeah, I did that. Check that one off the list, right? Do you get the flavor of this? So when he says, I'm first and the last, I'm God, I became dead. Yeah, that thing that frightens you. Man, I experienced that too. And guess what? I came out the other side. Okay. Please, stretch your mind with this a little bit, because one of the things I think he's communicating to everybody is this. What are the biggest challenges that you face in life? You're going to see this is all about pressure and challenges, and life is difficult. So we want to put it in that context. What are the biggest pressures you face in life? We could probably come up with a big long list. You know what most of humanity would say is number one? Can't get around dying. It's about the biggest thing you ever, right? I mean, you can prolong it. I mean, you can do all sorts of things, but you're going to die, right? So it's as though God is saying, okay, let's go ahead, put them out on the witness stand here. Let's on the evidence table. Let's just put all the things that you face. This is a big one. This is a big one. Here's the biggest one. Okay, here's a big one. I'll take care of that. Boom. Do you understand what he's doing? He's saying, this is the biggest thing you face. He says, that was no problem for me. Right? Okay. Acts chapter 26, when Paul's talking to King Agrippa, and he's going to make this plea. He's going to try to present the gospel to him. First thing he says, right? He's got this opportunity to talk to the king. First thing he says is, why do you find it strange that God can raise the dead? Okay, you can take that a couple different ways, but it's as though Paul is saying, what's the big deal here? This is nothing for God. Right? It's a big stumbling block for a lot of people. In fact, it was a stumbling block for the people in Athens, right? Because it's kind of like people coming back to life. Listen, I know it's not easy to get, but if you understand who God is, then you realize He's the only one who has the power over this. And once you realize that, there's nothing bigger. The biggest enemy, the biggest challenge we've ever faced, took care of that. Do you get this? Do you understand how he's couching, how he's setting up this letter? You can trust me, right? Having said that, having introduced himself, now we get into the situation here at Smyrna. He says, I know your afflictions. This word for afflictions, very interesting again. It's a word that literally means pressure. And the reason I appreciate that so much is this. Sometimes, I don't know about you, but sometimes I feel guilty. I feel guilty because, this is going to sound weird, but I'll tell you anyway. I feel guilty because nobody's ever tied me to the chair and broken my kneecaps with a stone because I'm a Christian. But a lot of Christians have had to endure that. A lot of Christians have been strung upside down every night in a prison camp and not fed for days because they were Christians. A lot of Christians suffer in a lot of different ways, and it's awful. And I hope you know it continues to this day in certain parts of the world. It is awful. But not everybody's going to go through that. But everybody's going to go through this. You know what this word means? It means it doesn't make any difference how big, how small. In fact, there are times when you might be embarrassed. You might say, this is such a little thing, I'm embarrassed to pray about it. But you know what? Those little things, you just keep adding on, and you keep adding on, and you keep adding on, and those little things get to the point where the pressure gets so great, you feel like, I can't take it. That big or small, this is a great way to describe what happens to every Christian. And Jesus is saying, the one who's got the answers is saying, listen, I know your afflictions and your poverty. It's not just bad enough that you got all these pressures in life. You don't have a lot of things that a lot of other people have. Yet you are rich. What in the world does he mean by that? You've got all this poverty, yet you are rich. Okay, quick personal story. I can do this. My wife's not here right now. Okay, so before my children were born, we were newly married, and I had an opportunity to go to a school. It was a seminary. It was at the University of British Columbia in Canada. We would live in Washington State. At the time, I was at the very first church I ever preached for. I was preaching at this place called Palatka, Florida. It's right up there with Manhattan and some other classic places. Anyway, in Palatka, Florida, I had this opportunity to go to school in British Columbia. So that meant, 2,000 some odd mile trip. And so my wife and I liquidated all our assets. We packed up my little Isuzu pickup truck, which, by the way, when I say my little Isuzu pickup truck, it was really the bank's Isuzu pickup truck. I was making payments on it, but everything we owned in this world was in the back of that pickup truck. And by the way, if you don't know what an Isuzu pickup truck is, it's not a big pickup truck. It's a little one. So everything we owned in the world was in the back of that pickup truck. And as we're taking off, leaving Florida, I turn to my wife and I say, we're rich. And she didn't appreciate that very much. But she knew exactly what I meant. And through the years, we have done this to each other at various times, especially when it was hard to pay the bills. We were going through some very difficult times. We would turn to each other and she would say to me, Mark, we're rich. And I would have to say, you're right. Because you don't just look at physical possessions. You look at relationships. You look at opportunities. And you look at the potential of what you can be doing for God. And this was a real pivotal time in our lives. We were going to a place where we'd have other ministry opportunities, get to work with other churches, and hopefully prepare to work with even more ministry opportunities as a result of going to school. And she knew that was what I was saying. All I'm trying to say is this. Sometimes we have to remind ourselves, if you're in Christ, you're rich. You got a bigger family than anybody. You may not even know it. You got resources available to you. You know, in Mark, the 10th chapter, Jesus said, there's not one of my followers who's given up home and brother and sister and relationships that will not receive 100-fold in this life. In this life. Okay, I gotta finish the quote, because Jesus also says, along with persecutions, it's going to be tough, but you're rich in the midst of your poverty. God is doing something for us even while we're here, but he wants us to remain faithful. So he says, I know all the pressure, but you're rich. I know about the slander of those who say they are Jews and they are not, but they're the synagogue. Synagogue just means meeting place, gathering. And the idea here is the people who think they're gathering to worship and serve God, they're not serving God at all. Whether they realize or not, they're being played by Satan. Satan is working through them. Unfortunately, we find this. All you got to do is read the book of Acts and see the persecution against the church. A lot of times the persecution was the greatest from the Jewish community. Man, they constantly were going after Paul. Well, here he's saying, listen, in Smyrna, you're going to have to watch out for people that you might have thought would be supportive of you. Oh, no. Sometimes that's what makes it hurt worse than anything else, is the very people you thought would be on your side, and they're not on your side, right? I would be remiss if I don't mention this. There's There's a guy who lived in Smyrna. His name was Polycarp. I don't know if you've ever read about this or not, but Polycarp was actually a disciple of the Apostle John. The Apostle John is the one that Jesus is using to write this letter. He was burned at the stake at Smyrna. He was 86 years old. It's a really famous story, but I don't have time. But if you want to look it up, it's a fascinating story. Anyway, so difficult times there, and he says, listen, do not be afraid of what you're about to suffer. I tell you, the devil will put some of you in prison to test you. I want to come back to that. This is a testing, and you will suffer persecution for 10 days. 10 days. He doesn't say 10 months, doesn't say 10 years, says 10 days. Don't think it's talking about a literal 10 days, because this is the book of Revelation. And he's already set it up from chapter 1. He's going to give us signs and symbols to try to communicate truth. But the idea here is it's going to be intense, but it's not going to last forever. I think we need that reminder. It's not going to last forever. This too will pass, as difficult as things are. But notice what he says to him. He says, be faithful. Remember who said this? He says, I'm the first and the last. I became dead and I came alive. You can trust him. Put your faith in him. You be faithful, even to the point of death, and I will give your life, you life as your victor's crown. You will be rewarded for the difficulties you're going through. James chapter 1, verse 2 says, consider it pure joy, my brothers, when you face trials of various kinds. Does that ever bother you? It's kind of like, what? When life gets really difficult, is that your first response? You know, some tragedy happens, some real great difficulty, the pressure just builds up. Is the first thing you say, wow, God, this is great? Why in the world would you do that? Well, James explains this. He says, consider it pure joy. Why? Because you know something. What do you know? You know that these are the things that build you up in the Lord. It produces character and endurance, steadfastness. Helps you grow. There's a guy by the name of Adam Grant, not a Christian guy. His latest book, however, is really, I find it very fascinating, and he's got a lot of studies that have been done. He's a psychologist. And he said that there's two people that he names a lot of different people, but there's two people I want to tell you about, Sarah and Benny. They are both polyglots. Polyglots are these people who can speak multiple languages. And as I understand it, a polyglot is not just a person who can speak multiple languages. They seem to have this ability, if you were to take a polyglot and just plop them down in an area of Africa where everybody spoke Swahili, and they'd never spoken Swahili before, and you came back in 3 weeks, they'd be conversing with the people in Swahili. And it's got, you've read about people like that. It's like, wow, they just have this ability. They can go anywhere, and they can pick up languages. I don't know if you've seen people like that or not. I often look at people like that and think, oh man, I wish I could do that. I'm so hard. Okay, the reason he talks about these two people, because most people assume, you've probably heard these rumors, you've probably heard people talk about, well, you know, children have this, what do they call it, neoplasticity. They have, their brains are a little bit different, and a toddler growing up anywhere can learn just about any kind of language, right? Because their brains are different. Well, that's partially true. But they study these polyglots like Sarah and Benny because they've learned something else. I've got a point to this, okay? They've learned something else because both Sarah and Benny went to several years of classes. Benny in particular took 3 years of Spanish. At the end of the year, 3 years of Spanish, he couldn't speak to a Spanish person more than one sentence. Right? And today he's a polyglot. And so it's kind of like, what was the flipping the switch? What changed? What's going on here? In a nutshell, I'm way oversimplifying this, but in a nutshell, here's what they discovered. They were willing to suffer. Let me try to explain this. They finally learned the key, for them anyway, in learning languages was this. A lot of people don't learn a language because they don't want to say anything until they really know how to pronounce the word, right? And so if you don't know how to pronounce the word, you don't want to embarrass yourself, so you don't even try to say it. And when you do say it the first time, boy, have I had this happen to me. You say it the first time, people laugh at you, or they're like, what in the world are you trying to say? And so you go quiet like, well, I'll never do that again, right? Well, polyglots, many of them learn, I don't care how embarrassed I am, I don't care how much I'm going to mess up, I'm going to learn 3 or 4 words and I'm just going to start saying those words. And people are going to laugh at me, and they're going to say I'm saying it wrong, and they're going to say, that's not the way you say it. And then the polyglots will say, well, can you tell me how I am supposed to say it? And then they'll say it the correct way. And then they'll use it in a sentence in a totally wrong, inappropriate way. And they'll say, don't ever say that again. Okay, what am I supposed to say? So they get embarrassed, they suffer, and people make fun of them, but in the process of going through that, since they're willing to suffer in that way, they learn the language faster than anybody. Do you understand? Do you understand how this way? You know why I like that illustration? I like that illustration because it makes a biblical point. A lot of the world's greatest athletes suffered in the gym to become a great athlete. The polyglots suffer embarrassment and awkward situations to become effective polyglots. And Christians suffer to become spiritual giants and strong people that other people can lean on. Right? It's part of it. I think that's what it's talking about. In 1 Peter, the first chapter, down around verses 6 and 7, it makes the point that he made in the previous verse about this is to test you. It says in 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 6 and 7, you know what persecution does? It doesn't just help you grow. It also, here's what he says, proves the genuineness of your faith. How do you know you're a Christian for the right reasons? How do you know you're serving God to serve God and not just because you want a better life and you want to go to heaven and don't want to go to hell? How do you know you're doing it for the right reasons? One of the best ways to figure out if you're doing this for the right reasons is have your life go really bad for a period of time. You know what? You're going to prove something to yourself. That I'm doing this because he's God. It's kind of like Peter. John chapter 6, when everybody else left and Jesus turns to his disciples and says, you going to leave too? Remember what he says? Nowhere else to go. It's just you. Man, you prove something to yourself. Listen, there's a lot of reasons for this, but one of the main reasons, Jesus says, I know you're going to get through and I'm going to reward you. I'm going to reward you. He says, whoever has ears to hear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. Do you hear what he's saying? He's saying, hang in there. It's going to be tough, but you can handle it. God's going to put limits on this. He's going to get you through. You can handle it, and he will reward you. Have ears to hear what the Spirit says to the churches? The one who is victorious will not be hurt at all by the second death. What in the world is the second death? Hebrews chapter 9, verse 26 and 27 is talking about the fact that it is appointed for man once to die, and after that face the judgment. You remember that? What it's saying is, by and large, other than the people who are here when Jesus returns, everybody else is going to die. So you die one time. After you die, next thing on your agenda, Judgment Day. Going to face Judgment Day. But if you're not right with Jesus, talks about this over in Revelation chapter 20. If you're not right with the Lord, then on Judgment Day, there will be a second death. And the second death is awful, and it never ends. And it's described over there. But when it describes the second death in Revelation chapter 20, it also says this. It says, those who have experienced the first resurrection, the second death has no power over them. When you go through the first resurrection, you don't have to worry about the second death. Well, what is the first resurrection? According to Romans chapter 6, verses 3 through 5, it says, when you are baptized into Christ, it says you're not only buried with Christ, you are resurrected with Christ. When you become a Christian, you go through the first resurrection. In fact, in Colossians, the 3rd chapter, it refers to Christians as those who have already been raised with Christ. So if you are a Christian, you have been, which by the way, just an aside here real quick, there was at the other campus over at Cocoa, there's a young lady who comes from almost no background at all. She started coming to church there a few months ago. She wanted to talk after church, study the Bible a little bit more. She wanted to find out what baptism was all about. We had the privilege of baptizing her into Christ this past Thursday, but the neat thing was, since she didn't understand this, she had to study the Bible. There was a lot of verses she had to read. So she got her aunt to sit down and read the Bible with her. So Thursday, when she came to be baptized, there were 2 people who got baptized in Christ this past Thursday. You know why we're always celebrating things like that? Because those who experience the first resurrection, guess what? It's not just, okay, you're part of the family now. Guess what? The second death has no power over you. There's an assurance you have about the future too. And that's what he's saying to us. So what's the message to the church? Here we go. It's hard, but it's worth it. When you go through suffering, it tells you who you really are. It really does tell you who you really are. And sometimes we're not happy with what we see. So you know what? We have an opportunity to change that. Also helps you grow like nothing else. But you will be rewarded. You really will, and you can trust him. This guy's name's Rick. You probably heard his story before. There's so many heroic stories they tell about 9/11. He was in the South Tower when the plane hit the North Tower. He was on the 44th floor. He was talking on his phone to his friend Dan. And so we know a lot of the stuff that was taking place in the last few minutes of his life. He was in charge of security over some of the companies that were in the South Tower. So he immediately gets off the phone. In the intercom system in the South Tower, after the North Tower had been hit, the intercom system in the South Tower was telling people, remain calm, do not evacuate. And Dan, being in charge of security for this large company, thought that's the dumbest thing you can possibly say. He said, I get the fact that you don't want people to panic. I understand that part. But staying in the building didn't seem like a wise idea to him. So he got his little megaphone there. He used it all the time. That's why they were able to take a picture of that earlier on. He got his little megaphone that he regularly used, and he went around and he started organizing people. He says, you know, we're not going to panic here, but we are going to get out of the building. He got over 2,900 people out of the South Tower before it went down. He went back in for a final check, and he lost his life when the South Tower came down. But the reason I'm telling you the story is this. It was quite some time later that they discovered 5 days before 9/11. 5 days before 9/11, Rick sent an email to one of his buddies at Boston University. And in the email, long email, but one of the things he said was, I've come to the conclusion I am never going to have a defining moment in my life. But in so many words, I'm committed to just be faithful in everything I do. His wife said the way he used to like to say it is, everybody lives by a code. You got to get a good code, and you got to stay in your lane. You got to keep the code. I love that. Christians have a code. It's called being faithful. And you know what? It not only prepares you for defining moments, it prepares you for the defining moment, eternity. Tells you who you really are, helps you grow. And Jesus is watching, right? So we're going to go to communion time right now. And there are two things I really want you to think about. Jesus is the one who gets us right with God. We always remember that. That's the purpose for his death. But we also remember he became dead. It's just a phase he went through. Death was something he could handle. He has the power over death. And because of that, he's proven himself trustworthy. And he sees the pressure that we're going through. And he's on our side. Would you bow and pray? And when you're ready, would you come to the table?